thank you so much for coming. I thought there might be just my family here, so it's really lovely to see so many faces this evening. It gives me inordinate pleasure to be presenting at the VWML Lecture Library Series. As part of my own research, I listened to a tape recording of Joan Flett's 1984 lecture, The Development of Social Dancing in England, and I feel very proud to be given the chance to talk for an hour, hey, about social folk dance. How wonderful. There should be lots of time for questions at the end, so please do jot down anything you would like clarifying or expanding. If you can't hear me, however, please indicate, catch my eye, and I will endeavour to do better. Don't hesitate on that one, just go for it. So whilst Joan Flett's title had no folk after the social, this talk is a little more emphatic on its emphasis on folk dance. My focus is on the influence of the English Folk Dance and Song Society, which I'll be calling the EFDAS. That's the charity that's based in this building here. And the folk revival. Now, this might come as a disappointment to anyone who has come looking for a talk on disco and jive. However, I hope to demonstrate how popular social dance forms did help to shape folk dance in England throughout the 20th century. So what is social folk dance? I've heard quite a few discontented comments on the use of this phrase over the course of my PhD research. After all, if this is social dancing, then what is Morris dancing? Is it anti-social dancing? The types of dancing which I refer to as social folk dancing have a number of other names. Folk dance, English folk dance, country dance, Playford dance, barn dances, ceilidhs and dances for those in the know. So it seems sensible to use an umbrella term, especially as it is one that seems to have been used more commonly by the EFDAS quite recently. So as Nick said, that's my name, Chloe Middleton-Metcalfe. I'm currently in the process of completing my PhD in dance studies at the University of Roehampton. I started in 2016, took a 6-month break in 2018 to do the bibliography that we mentioned, and I hope to hand in my thesis soon. I come from a family of folk enthusiasts. Childhood holidays were folk camps. My father plays in a dance band, a number of dance bands, and we have a family band, and we play for barn dances in and around Milton Keynes. Now, my thesis is in 2 parts. The first is historical, and it uses interviews and the paper trail to document changes in practice of social folk dance over time. And the second is to use academic jargon, ethnographic, in other words, field work, going out to find out what people are doing today. My primary interest from the start was on the wider perception of folk dance in England, and so my focus was, as much as possible, on non-specialist practice. So in my fieldwork, I visited events hosted by and for non-folk dancers, including Rotary groups, the WI, churches, and anyone else who would let me in. So with that caveat in mind, I've decided today to discuss 8 micro-topics drawn from my thesis, which I hope you will find of interest rather than presenting you with a single linear argument. These are the 8 topics. I did have a section on Englishness, but I timed my presentation and it took too long, so I axed it. But if you're interested in this, ask me at the end and I can indulge you. So I'm going to start with a man called Douglas Kennedy, because English social folk dance in the 20th century was largely refashioned by one man. Douglas Neil Kennedy took over the running of the English Folk Dance Society, as it was then, in 1924, after the death of its founder and better known figure Cecil Sharp, and Kennedy stayed in post until 1961. Now, by some measures, Sharp's revival had been very successful. In 1909, country dancing was added to the government's influential, if not compulsory, syllabus for state schools, and thousands of teachers were rolling in the society's vacation classes. However, this had largely failed to result in the repopularisation of folk dance, at least in Kennedy's opinion. Some individuals, mostly middle-class women, were enthusiastic folk class attendees, undergoing and passing their 3-tier folk dancing certificates. But this interpretation of English folk dance did not please Kennedy. He was keen to recontextualise folk dancing as a social activity, an alternative to the predominant couple-based repertoire of the ballroom, which largely consisted of waltzes, foxtrots and quick-steps. 3 groups of dancers influenced Kennedy's decision to change the approach of the society. In the 1920s, he travelled to North America, where he had witnessed square dancing with a caller to prompt the dances. I'll talk more about the caller later. Secondly, Kennedy made contact with traditional English dancers, those that were operating outside of the folk revival. And in addition to Sword and Morris teams, this did include people who were holding social dances. A third source of inspiration came from Europe. European dance teams performed at the EFDS's, or English Folk Dance Society's, Royal Albert Hall festivals in the 1930s, and reciprocal arrangements were made to host the EFDS's demonstration teams in Europe. This allowed for direct comparison between the different dance styles and methods of performance. And Kennedy reflected that it was always noticeable that by the side of these foreign folk dancers, our own country dancing looked colourless and mechanical. Kennedy changed the suggested repertoire of the society. Sharp had mainly focused on a set of dances called Playford dances, and Playford dances refers to the repertoire of one particular publisher. John Playford published various editions of a book called The Dancing Master, starting in 1651. So this is a 17th and early 18th century repertoire. Whilst Kennedy did not ban Playford dances, he argued that the emphasis should be on recruitment, and that these historical dances were not accessible to the general public. Now Cecil Sharp had been quite particular about the types of dances he collected, focusing on country dances. Now today, country dancing is used in a broad umbrella sense, but in the past, in its historical form, it meant dances in long ways formation, which is women facing men across the set. Squares, or quadrilles as Sharp would have known them, were interlopers, not folk dancers. But by the 1930s, unsurprisingly, attitudes had changed. Square dances were now suitably old, and a number, such as La Rousse, for example, were collected and put into the EFDS's repertoire. In a 1940 article directed to EFDS members, Kennedy discussed the growing appeal of these traditional dances. I think that the reason for this change in favour of the traditional dances is that they are more direct in their appeal, simpler to perform, and carry no distasteful reminiscences of the school folk dancing that was reserved for wet days. The comments of some Northern Festival attendee, who was either Danish, Estonian, Greenlander or Faroe Islander, I cannot work out which, regarding the lack of English social folk dances, influenced Kennedy's push for the abandonment of the Playford repertoire. As Kennedy was to recall in his memoirs, the Northern dancers thought that Playford country dances were more like little ballets than social dances, and Derek Schofield has written a great paper on this subject if you want to read more about it. Kennedy's new repertoire focus is displayed in the various volumes of the Community Dances Manual available on that table over there. Volume 1 was published in 1947 and contained music and dance description for 14 dances, slender volume, and of these the majority were collected in England in the early 20th century. Only one was a Playford dance, Hole in the Wall, and one a simple recent composition, the Belfast Duck, which was written by Douglas Kennedy to help people deal with long ways progressive dances. As well as promoting English folk dancing, Douglas Kennedy, along with his wife Helen, were keen to support American square dancing. And links have been cultivated between American and English folk revival dancers since Cecil Sharp's first collecting trip to the Appalachian Mountains in 1916. And so Kennedy's enthusiasm for the square dancing he saw in Massachusetts in 27 and 28, courtesy of the American Country Dance Society, was not out of party line. Douglas and Helen Kennedy increased their knowledge during a 37 trip, seeing traditional square dancing in Ohio, Tennessee and Chicago, and the findings of this culminated in the publication of Square Dances of America and various experiments in square dancing at English festivals. By 1941, Helen Kennedy was able to identify a vogue for American squares amongst members of the EFDS. In a peak of square dance enthusiasm, which belied any historical accuracy, Kennedy would write that the square dance is, in essence, quote, older than anything found in Playford, a veteran amongst the traditionals. This is really stretching the truth. One of the reasons for Kennedy's enthusiasm for square dances was its perceived male attraction, and Kennedy was keen to enlist more men. By the end of World War II, it was estimated that there were 10 female members of the EFTAS to every man. It was common for women to partner women at both social evenings of folk dance and public displays, and Kennedy felt that all female or female majority groups did not give a public image which would encourage mass participation. Calling was one particular aspect of square dancing which was felt to appeal to men. Kennedy thought that the calling liberated the dancers as they no longer had to memorise the order of the figures and could thus immerse themselves completely in the dance itself. Calling also furthered Kennedy's pro-male agenda. He argued that having a prompter to guide the participants dissolved the reticence of young men. These young men, he thought, had previously been, quote, hesitating on the brink of joining in. But calling helped to relieve their worries as they were drawn to the social folk dance, but feared to mess things up for others through ignorance of the routine. It is interesting to note that choreographic simplicity and verbal guidance is linked to greater male participation, and perhaps having a caller also added a further layer of acceptable mediation between an undesirably effeminate display of dancing skill and an acceptably masculine level of participation. So if you look at dance histories more generally, sort of from the late 19th century, there's more reticence of males to go to dancing classes in Britain and learn how to dance properly, and that's something that is reflected in what I'm trying to say here. So you don't have to go to classes, the caller will tell you what to do. Excellent. Calling practices have changed over time. Today, caller is the name given to an individual, like this individual here, who will select a programme of dances, specifically this one, liaise with the musicians or arrange recorded music, teach the dancers and verbally prompt the dancers. The dances themselves are usually fixed repeating sequences, and some callers aim to stop verbally prompting as early as possible, whilst others will issue verbal prompts throughout. When the caller was introduced, it was quite a different approach to calling than you'll find today. So their 1942 Caller's Manual, which accompanied their square dance publication, gives calls which the caller can put together in their own preferred order, which is similar to what we might think of as the American mould today, with the caller providing additional witty patter, possibly singing instructions to fit the tune. Peter Kennedy made a number of recordings with the Haymakers in the early 1950s, using just this style, which I have played at the beginning of the lecture. Because I've got so much to talk to you about, I thought that would save me 5 minutes. So that style of singing, ring, ring, pretty little ring, that style of American, what we might consider to be American style calling now. Douglas Kennedy wanted a new way of approaching folk dance. Infection, not perfection. When he took over the EFTAS, social folk dancing was typically taught in termly graded classes. Whilst performances, which were often called demonstrations, were a regular feature of social folk dance classes at the time, there were examples of more informal dancing. So dance parties were sometimes held by classes where participants could dance pre-learned choreographies in a more informal manner. As Kennedy would later recall, Cecil Sharp had insisted that there should be side to side with teaching, quote, occasions when people should just get together for the fun of it, for the hell of it, and enjoy life. This social element to the dancing is something that Kennedy felt he had enlarged upon rather than invented from scratch. Kennedy advocated that good folk dancing does not come from a studied, consciously learnt technique. And I'm bearing in mind what Nick said earlier about this being a more natural dance form. It is far better for dancers to pick up the elements of the simplest dance at parties and to acquire a natural, unself-conscious approach to rhythmical expression. Kennedy was all for the idea of naturalness in dance. So, that's one of 8 micro-themes. I'm going to move on to the square dance boom, which again we've already had some allusions to. Kennedy created the template for contemporary social folk dance events. But he was most fortunate that his changes coincided with a popular dance craze. Now, it's not clear, and it never will be, how well established social folk dancing events might have become were it not for the square dance boom, which was instigated by photos of the then Princess Elizabeth square dancing with evident enjoyment during a state visit to Canada in 1951. Outside of the EFTAS, experiments in teaching squares were being considered by some British dance teachers as early as 1944, so this doesn't entirely come out of nowhere. In the 1940s and 1950s, square dancing had a much greater popular visibility than English social folk dance, thanks to its inclusion in widely distributed American films. Gone with the Wind, Destry Rides Again, My Darling Clementine, Welcome Stranger, The War of the Worlds, Shane, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, Oklahoma, I could go on. Square dancing also had a noticeable British radio and television presence, with personnel often connected to dance schools and professional teaching alliances. So, with widespread interest in the private lives of the British royal family, this was a highly influential publicity coup for square dance teachers and the EFTAS. Pictures of the royal couple were circulated in the British press, spurring an increased popular interest in square dancing. And in fact, very shortly afterwards, showman turned holiday entrepreneur Billy Butlin sent a staff member called Kay Burry to New York to learn how to square dance. By the 24th of November, it's only a few months later, the Butlins team were demonstrating square dancing for BBC television. They performed at prestigious London venues, including the Savoy, the Ritz and Grosvenor House, doing square dancing in the cabaret spot and then getting the audience up to dance. And they made several radio and television appearances in the early 1950s, produced a number of records and a square dancing booklet, which is pictured here, Francis and Day's Square Dance Instructions, Calls and Music. Peter Kennedy, who was Douglas Kennedy's son, recalled that the square dance boom had unearthed pistol-packing cowboys and cowgirls across the land. Dancers arrived at Cecil Sharp House, the London headquarters of the society here, dressed in cowboy hats, sheriff's badges and spurs, wanting to do DosyDoes. In the 1950s, square dances would have been some of the first places in Britain where jeans were worn, especially for evening attire, and their association with North America would have been apparent. Some events were even described as being like Wild West cowboy romps, the fancy dress balls of square dancing. It is possible to witness legacies of the overlap between English social folk dance and the square dance boom in a specific bodily movement. In particular, the practice of doing a dosey-do with the arms crossed in front of the torso in sailor or hornpipe style, this sort of thing. This styling was not taught by the EFTAS, or neither was it taught by clubs affiliated to the British Association of American Square Dance Callers. In fact, the dosey-do itself did not become a standard back-to-back figure until the mid-1950s. Until then, it could actually describe a variety of partner or solo figures. But manuals from both sides of the Atlantic advocated a variety of dosey-do movements and arm stylings, and you can see from this Butlins picture that they're really into their arm stylings. At least 3 British published manuals illustrate or describe a position where the arms are crossed on the dosey-do, and 2 of these handbooks are affiliated to British square dance display teams. Bob's Frank's Happy Hoedowners, and if you have a rainy afternoon, go on the London Film Archive and type in Bob Franks and his Happy Hoedowners, and you can get square dance calling in the 1950s in a strong Cockney accent, and it's quite brilliant. And the Butlins Square Dance Display Team. It is possible that some people who learnt square dancing at holiday camps or from the television passed on such styling to others. Certainly in some instances it was taught in school lessons as part of learning how to do a dosey-do or back-to-back. The square dance boom is usually viewed as being past its commercial peak by 1954, yet the influence of this popular dance movement on English social folk dance events was still tangible during my fieldwork in 2017 and 2018. Aspects of barn dance culture which sit uncomfortably for some keener dancers, such as dressing up as cowboys, using tunes such as Camp Down Races or She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, appear to derive from attempts to popularise English folk dancing by associating it with a particular interpretation of white Americana, as Reg Hall reflected in an interview, the English idea of what hillbillies were. And so I'm just going to stay in America for the next enigmatically titled part of my presentation, Towards America and Away from Old Time. So in this section I will argue that the society's approach was affected by a rival popular dance movement. So we've discussed square dancing, we're now going to move on to old time. And the rivalry with the old time societies accounts for, in part, the curious lack of support for couple dances in the society. And I think it also helps to explain why a number of additional Americanisations were adopted. In the 1930s, it became common to use old time, or oldie-timey, if it's written out, to refer to the music, songs and dances of the late Victorian era. Now, quite a few of you might be familiar with North American old-time music. In the 1970s, this became in many ways synonymous with traditional or folk white North American music. In England, it was quite a different situation. The old-time movement was largely associated with professional dancing associations and remained largely distinct from the folk revival. However, despite its distinctness, there was actually quite a lot of similarity between the Eftus and Kennedy's folk revival and the old-time movement. Both were nostalgic social dance genres which are rooted in a firmly white British paradigm and ran counter to popular dance trends. It is noticeable that both old-time teacher Francis Joseph Maney and folk propagator Douglas Kennedy worried that their chosen dance genre was popularly regarded as some sort of queer cult. Many of the tunes used for the old-time radio programme Those Were the Days, which only stopped broadcasting in the 1970s, but started in the 1940s, would have been familiar to folk music enthusiasts, and they included arrangements of tunes such as Shepherd's Hay and The Keel Row. Old-time events of the 1950s were often perceived to be comparatively formal, so they operated a policy of book dances. Will you dance the next one with me? Good, will you dance the one with me after that? Yes, excellent. Book dances, white gloves and strict floor etiquette, escorting the woman back to her seat afterwards or to the buffet, this kind of thing, asking someone to dance quite formally. Now, Kennedy used these contextual formalities to delineate between the two genres. The element which marks the distinction, he wrote, lies in the traditional music used and in the lack of sophistication in the Eftus style of dancing. Surely such commentary indicates the desire to differentiate, which can perhaps only come from similarity and its subtleties rather than from overt choreographic differences. Okay, I'm going to get a bit technical now. As well as the embrace of calling and square dances, Douglas Kennedy also adopted less obvious Americanisations, such as the conversion of long-waist duple minor set dances, which is diagram 1, into Sicilian Circles, diagram 2. Maud Carpeles, who was a folk song and dance collector, had already noted that the country dance survived in America in 3 forms: the square dance, the long waist set, diagram A, and the progressive round, which was her term to describe dances in number 2 formation, which I call couple facing couple formation, but most folk dancers will know as Sicilian circle formation. Couple facing couple formation avoids the changeover of parts at the top and bottom of the set needed for diagram 1 if you're doing it in duple minor formation, and the need to stand out one rotation of the dance. Don't worry if you don't follow all of this. If we were doing a Kaylee, I'd walk it through really gently, but there's not much point for the point of this talk. But needless to say, these are 2 of the trickier technical elements of duple minor long waist dances. So I'm curious, why did the Eftus decide to call this couple facing couple formation Sicilian Circles? Well, in 1927, Carpeles collected a couple facing couple dance called Sicilian Circle in Massachusetts. Although it was never published, perhaps it was taught and disseminated throughout the society. In the 1950s, suggestions were made in English Dance and Song, which is the house magazine of the Eftus, that clubs could make up Sicilian circles using a combination of simple figures, and this idea was repeated in subsequent Eftus publications. Now this was really similar, the suggestion was really similar to what Maud Carpeles had suggested in 1932. She says that in New England, many of the long ways dances, and rounds, there is no great variety, she says, and many of the dancers merely ring the changes on figures such as balance and swing, ladies' chain, promenade right and left, etc. Now, outside of the society, this type of dance formation, number 2, was more widely known as Circassian Circle. Circassian Circle referred to a dance in couple-facing couple formation. So if you look at old-time dance manuals of the 1940s and early 1950s, Circassian Circle was a choreographically flexible dance in couple-facing couple formation which used combinations of any quadrille figures, just like Maud Carpelese's Ring the Changes and the suggestions made in the 1950s that you can make up simple Sicilian circles. One argument for the replacement of the well-known term Circassian Circle with the lesser-known American one, Sicilian Circle, can be found in the FDIS's desire to differentiate from the old-time dance movement. Circassian Circle, as it became known to folk dancers, was also notably different to how it was known to old-time dancers. Increasingly, the single ring figure, figure number 3, became popular, and this was known separately to old-time dancers as the flirtation figure, which is a quadrille figure. So we've got a proper chopping and changing going on here. And alongside the names, the FDIS also proffered different music. Old-time dancers often used the eponymous tune called Circassian Circle, which is not that well known now, but I love it, so I'm going to sing it. But in contrast, the Community Dances Manual suggests Irish Washerwoman, Mrs. McLeod's Real, and or Old Zip Coon, which is also known as Turkey in the Straw. The replacement of the widely known couple-facing couple version of Circassian Circle with a single circle dance, which was more commonly known as the flirtation, illustrates how FDIS-affiliated callers replaced dances which had a wider social currency with folk revival versions. And I have other examples of this fascinating trend towards America, for example in the replacement of Paul Jones, a popular couple change dance of the 1930s, with Lucky 7, a dance with opaque American origins, the Americanization of Sir Roger de Coverley into the Virginia Reel, and what happened to the heel and toe polka. If you're interested, ask me at the end. So, throughout the 20th century, the FDIS continued to foster strong links with North American folk dance aficionados. North American and English folk dancers appear to have been considered to be largely interchangeable by Douglas and Helen Kennedy, who were largely running the show at that point. In fact, Helen Kennedy speculated that most of the English traditional dancers have their American counterpart dance to the same tunes. Gosh, what a claim. And such a claim was never made for dance traditions from geographically more proximate countries such as Scotland, Ireland, France or Wales, which I find quite astounding. Forging links with American practices distanced the FDIS from the old-time dance societies. Now, why would this be? Peter Kennedy suggested professional courtesy, that the FDIS were being told to stay away from promoting couple dances, which were the preserve of the old-time dance teachers. However, maybe the FDIS had other motivations. When the Society embarked on a joint project with Harry Davidson's Old-Time Dance Orchestra in 1956, on Those Were the Days, which was broadcast on BBC Radio, a poll was made of listeners, which reported that some supported the inclusion of folk dancing because it attracted a younger demographic. So, talking of younger demographics, I'm just going to take a moment. And then we're going to go to folk dancing in schools. The topic of folk dancing in schools is one that usually arouses gloomy statements by folk dance enthusiasts that there isn't enough of it. So it may come as a surprise then to find out that modern educational dance promoters who, from the 50s, 60s and 70s, felt the problem with country dancing was that there was too much of it. A 1977 study of 1,336 primary schools in England and Wales found that 77% of schools taught some form of folk dance. Now, this was much higher than the number who taught modern educational or creative dance, and was only trumped by schools which used the BBC dance and drama radio broadcasts. until the national curriculum was introduced in 1988. Official government guidance was often more of an ideal than a reflection of contemporary practice. So whilst this section is predominantly about the decline in support for folk dancing in the official government guidance during the 20th century, I wish to reiterate that country dancing left the feet of school children much more slowly than many dance histories would imply. At the beginning of the 20th century, as I mentioned at the beginning, at the beginning of the 20th century, many state schools were not segregated by age, so elementary schools provided for children up to the age of 14. The government first issued a physical education syllabus in 1902, and it was considered to be too much like military drill. So its third revised edition in 1909 included more child-friendly activities, including folk dances and singing games. This was one of Sharp's big achievements in pedagogy. The decline of country dancing as the dance genre of choice by the educational authorities coincided with a change in pedagogic outlook in the 1920s. In the arts more broadly, modernism was developing as the principal dominant paradigm, and with this emphasis came a stress upon continual invention. Progressivism, also an outlook which largely relegates the role of tradition, was to become increasingly consequential in pedagogic theory and training, and there was a strong link between progressive educationalists, who stressed the importance of learning directed by the child itself, and modern dance. Starting in experimental private schools, child-centred approaches to learning advocated by proponents such as John Dewey and Frederick Froebel were to grow in influence and would fundamentally alter the approach to dance in physical education. There you go, that's pedagogic history covered too. So in 1933, the Board of Education published its updated syllabus of physical training for schools. Dancing as a subject comprises a whole 3 pages of 300. But it does include a section on the use of music for younger children, under 7, in which musical activity games including 9 pins and Pop Goes the Weasel were advocated. There were concerns for the prescriptive nature of folk dancing, even by 1933, and the syllabus suggested free movement and simple made-up dances in addition to set national dances. Under types of dances, the authors state that folk and national dances are clearly the type of dance best suited to the needs of children. The book then listed in the following order: English country dances, Scottish country dances, the folk dances of different continental nations, and finally Morris and sword dances for both sexes. English country dancing is considered to be particularly appropriate because of its simple natural steps and attractive music. Now there's a whole body of work against dance and naturalness, and I don't want any of you to come away from this and think dance is, there's a lot of baggage attached to the idea of dance being natural, and I don't have time to go into that today, but I'm just putting that in as a caveat. So it's quite a problematic thing to say that English country dancing is simple natural steps and attractive music. But anyway, between this guidance and the new post-Second World War syllabus introduced in 1952, British educationists were increasingly warming to the movement theories of German modern dance proponents. Starting in the 1920s, a small number of British female educationists started to promote what was then referred to as Central European dance. Ultimately, it would be Hungarian-born modern dance pioneer Rudolf Laban who appears to have had the most influence in British dance education, despite sources which indicate that he had little interest in it. Laban emigrated to Britain in 1937, staying here for the rest of his life. In 1941, the influential Ling Association of Physical Education Instructors hosted a conference on modern educational dance, and this was really pioneering in the turn away from folk dance towards modern educational dance. The organisers went on to petition the Board of Education to promote the genre, and holiday courses were run. The government funded courses for teachers in the Laban method. Laban published Modern Educational Dance, outlining his schema for dance training in schools, and the rest is history, more or less. In modern educational dance, Laban surmised that traditional or national dances were characterised by the employment of uncreative pattern following. Moreover, he questioned the propriety and purpose of studying movements supposedly created by societies of the past. In the 1952 guidance from the Ministry of Education, called Moving and Growing, country dancing had already been replaced as the primary genre of choice. by Laban-derived modern educational dance. Now, the ministry argued that folk dances were originally dances for adults and are, despite previous guidance to the contrary, unsuitable for children. Rather than memorising set patterns of dance figures, the ministry suggested that making up simple dances is a more appropriate activity for young children. In a 1953 publication, the compilers once more warn against the teaching of folk dances to children, reiterating that these are dances for adults. But interestingly, they also discouraged teachers from using the dances most favoured by Sharp, the playful dances we mentioned earlier, such as gathering peace quads and roughy tufty. These they considered to be too complicated, and they suggested simpler dances collected during the 20th century, such as the Long Eight or the Durham Reel. Now, this mirrored Kennedy's wider approach to English folk dance repertoire and his move away from more historical material. So arguably then, Douglas Kennedy was still influencing the government approach in 1952 and 53, but folk dance had already lost its preeminent position as the dance genre of choice. The extent to which Kennedy was truly perturbed by the loss of English folk dance tuition in schools is unknown, but his writings indicate that he felt that the popularity for the genre lay outside rather than inside compulsory juvenile education, and indeed his entire attitude towards dance in schools seems to be rather ambiguous in the written documentation that is left behind. So now, I'm going to move on to the most controversial part of my presentation today, footwork. So I put in my blurb for this presentation why all the dancers walked, and part of me wishes that I hadn't, because it has received the most hostile response from people who have read the blurb. So whilst not all English social folk dances are walked, the majority of the dances I witnessed during my field work were. And the second most common method of stepping is skipping, not anything else. So why is it that walking came to be the most predominant method of moving in this dance form? Well, you can have a look at Sharp again. Sharp was of the opinion that the country dance is preeminently a figure dance, depending in the main for its expressiveness upon the weaving of patterned, concerted evolutions rather than upon intricate steps or elaborate body movements. Certainly, much social folk dance development has been focused on these concerted evolutions rather than on the movement of the feet. However, there are indications that stepping was an intrinsic part of country dancing for at least some traditional dancers. Helen Kennedy recounted the polka step she witnessed in Warwickshire in 1911, where the men cocked their free leg up behind to get a good send-off. Polka step is 1, 2, 3, hop, 1, 2, 3, hop, 1, 2, 3, hop. Maud Carpelle's recorded of the dances she saw in Northumberland that one was the sets, a form of quadrille in which the stepping is a remarkable feature, which just reminds me of Irish set dancing now, but sadly she didn't record any of this remarkable stepping. However, in the country dance book, Sharp described the normal step for country dancing as a springy walking step, 2 to each bar, executed by the women with a natural, unaffected grace, and on the part of the men with a complacent bearing and certain jauntiness of manner. Eminent dance researcher Tom Fleck supports this idea when he noted, some 60 years later, the use of a lovely lilting step in Orkney, which he said was similar to the step used by the traditional dancers of Northern England. So in addition to introducing calling, Kennedy also moved away from teaching particular stepping patterns. The dance walk was considered to be an ideal introduction to country dancing, particularly for those whose only previous experience has been of ballroom dancing. They even produced the 1939 pamphlet Walking on Air, in which Sir Douglas and Helen Kennedy wrote that country dancing is only a glorified walking about by a group of people in a musical design. At times, additional small steps are interposed between each walk, giving such variations as skipping, gallop and polka, but all the dances are in fact built upon the simplest form of step, the walk, which everyone employs in everyday life, each in his individual way. Such a description of the walking step gives the impression of a non-tutored movement. However, the dance walk demonstrated in the Kennedys' 1955 instructional video, the Cumberland Square 8, shows a deliberate practice movement which is far from natural. Now, the sound quality is absolutely dreadful. I've made a transcription of what I assume Kennedy is saying, which I'm going to say over the top. You'll understand when I play the clip. And now for the style. This is a lilting walk. Leave the lilt out and look at it, just to mark time. All the stuffing gone now. Now notice the difference. The dance walk is a lilt. Lilt and enjoy. The lilt starts off the back foot, the trot is slightly delayed. Slow it up. It's undulating, effortless. Like a bird on the wing. Or like a wave before it breaks on the beach. Just look at this for undulation. That's a great film if you want to see more of it. Folk dancing 1950s. No matter how tutored the Kennedys' dance walk was for keen dancers, enthusiastic dancers, walking appears to have been an important part of the evangelism of folk dance. And folk dance was not the only genre in which the simplification of movement steps was considered to be key to increased participation. If you look at modern ballroom dance teachers in the first half of the 20th century, they emphasised, like Kennedy, natural walking movements, with the popular mantra being, if you can walk, you can dance. Dance historian Tess Butlins has discussed the popularity of the one-step in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which she says removed any obvious need for specialist dance tuition, inviting dancers onto the floor to walk beat for beat, which might sound familiar to folk dancers today. As with other elements of style and etiquette, stepping is not usually focused upon at non-specialist events today. Callers are usually focused on dealing with the challenges of inspiring, enjoyable participation. And in fact, many callers are essentially teaching the basics of sequence dancing to attendees who are often increasingly unfamiliar with structured social dance at all. And often they're teaching without the assistance of any demonstration. Footwork, as with other aspects of dance style, is seen as something which comes with more experience at events for keen dancers, such as folk festivals. So I'm going to move on now to something a bit less contentious. Fun. The most often reiterated purpose of social folk dance in England in the present day appears to be that it enables participants to have fun. Fun is used to explain the meaning and purpose of social folk dance. But how does the stress and emphasis upon fun shape callers' and participants' expectations, approaches and experiences? In the writing section of my questionnaire, I managed to get back about 726 questionnaires from 30 dance events. Fun was raised by some 20 correspondents, from short answers such as good fun to longer comments such as we are privileged to see how music and dance creates community and fun. Articulations of fun as a core principle appear to arise in the pages of English Dance and Song, at least, just after Kennedy's retirement. In 1962, Hugh Rippon, then head of publicity for the EFTAS, wrote an article considering the best way to advertise both the society and folk dancing more broadly. He firstly dismissed an approach based on Englishness, and secondly an approach based on traditionality, to focus on what he considered to be a more commercially viable prospect. Our selling point could be that we are offering something friendly, sociable, and with the fun element ranking highly. I believe that there is a correlation between the comparatively large and public emphasis on fun and the primary role of the caller as teacher, although a lot of callers don't like that term, who introduces figures or combinations of figures which are largely unfamiliar to participants. There appears to be a recognised connection between fun and novelty. Indeed, sociologist Walter Pawlczak has made a distinction between fun and enjoyment, positing that fun is associated with unfamiliarity, whilst enjoyment is strengthened through prior knowledge. In other studies of dance, or leisure more generally, fun is often associated with unserious leisure. In sociologist Robert Stebbins' influential categorisation, unserious leisure, though hardly humiliating or despicable, is nonetheless too fleeting, mundane and commonplace for most people to find a distinctive identity in it. It could be argued that fun is often referred to as the raison d'etre of folk dance because it is a non-serious leisure activity, although I do recognise the circuitous nature of that comment. Unlike the concepts of pleasure derived from mastering technique, fun was not generally used in the sense of satisfaction of achievement. One of my interviewees directly linked the fun of participation to the ineptitude of her fellow dancers. The ones I was dancing with were just as bad as me, actually, so it was quite fun. Similarly, one dance attendee responding to a question about their relationship with dancing wrote in the questionnaire, "I'm useless at dancing, but enjoy the fun." Oh, no. At the EFTA's Callers Development Day, one caller referred to how often he hears people say that going wrong in a folk dance is all part of the fun of it. In this instance, he discussed how teenagers in particular often wanted guidance on how to do the dance properly in order to have the confidence to engage with it fully. That he felt the need to discuss the importance of teaching the movements emphasises, I think, the prevalence of the importance of fun over figurative correctness. An important implication for this emphasis on fun rather than skill or perhaps etiquette is that such an approach can result in a higher risk of bodily injury to the self and or to other participants. One of my interviewees in his early 20s recalled his first Caellia to University finishing party in Edinburgh, where everyone was having quite a lot of fun and sort of spirits were high. I came out bruised, it was quite wet on the floor and it was quite wild. So fun appears to be central to many discourses about social folk dance today, particularly in the non-specialist environments I was looking at. And they exceed considerations of other reasons for participation and enjoyment you could think of, such as skill, tradition, identity. Fun is associated with non-serious leisure, novelty, and ineptitude. Going wrong in a comparatively supportive environment such as barn dances is considered to be fun. And Walter Polachuk's article is great because he talks about how fun is essentially related to activity and activity with others, and it's an inherently social form. He says it's impossible to have fun on your own. So there's that additional social element which I haven't put into this particular talk. But I had to rewrite that chapter today, so it's fresh in my mind. Because of the comparative scarcity of considerations of fun in leisure and dance studies, and it is a bit like a desert, it is difficult to compare the extent to which this level of focus on fun is unique to social folk dance. Because other dance forms which also aim to attract newcomers also utilise a focus on fun in their public discourses. So please, can more people take fun seriously? Moving on, music. Very exciting chart. I know I could play you a musical track, but I'm going to show you a chart instead. In my fieldwork, I noted that dances are rarely associated with particular tunes. Cumberland Square 8 to My Love Is But a Lassie Yet, or Atoll Highlanders, is a notable exception. So here you can see the diversity of melody and tempo for the most popular dance, the Sicilian Circle. In just some instances it went on to 2 pages, but I cut the second page out. In 1957, Douglas Kennedy saw tune substitution as an additional way to add popular appeal, writing that many of the country dance airs are difficult on piano, and it is far better to pick on community dances which can be danced to easy, popular tunes. To the layman, the choice of a popular tune can make him believe that he knows the dance before he starts. More important than dance tune association is the marrying of musical to choreographic phrase. And this is not specific to England, but it can be found in other similar social dance forms in Britain and further afield. So most melodies are arranged into 2 8-bar phrases, which are referred to as the A music and B music, although some tunes might have 3 or more parts. In my fieldwork, most dances were performed to melodies in 4/4 or 6/8, known as jigs. 6/8 is known as jigs, with a minority in 3/4, waltz time, or 9/8, slip or hop jigs. Often the metre as well as the melody was not fixed, so for the same dance one caller might ask the band to play a tune in 6/8 jigs, whilst another might ask for a tune in 4/4. With the exception of hornpipes, which are in 4/4, callers might attempt to teach a step hop. The selection of metre appears to make little difference to the dance, as the same walking step is used for most metres. This is a step hop. One version of. Becoming out of phrase with the music is generally seen by callers and keen dancers as a problem which needs to be corrected. And I recorded a number of events in my field work when callers directed dancers to wait until the start of the next musical phrase before initiating the next sequential move. And while swinging is often employed in this manner at folk festivals and such events, this was less frequent at the dances of my research, which was on non-specialists. So dancers often responded to the direction to wait by clapping until the end of the phrase came round. Now, once the dance had started, it was very unusual that the music was ever stopped before the conclusion of the dance, even when participants fell over. However, from time to time, callers would make the decision to abort the dance when the dancers became out of phrase. The use of calling appears to increase the importance of aligning phrasing because disparity of action across sets is problematic for a caller. Most callers aspire to have all the sets, which are groups of dancers, going through the same figures at the same time so that one verbal prompt is appropriate for all. The marriage of phrasing to music is very ingrained in the culture of this dance form, so it is highly unusual for a dance figure to go across the phrasing of the music, and dancers are encouraged to increase or decrease their pace so that the music and dance phrases are synchronised. So how does phrasing add to the enjoyment of the event for participants? The stress on phrasing is related to the centrality of the caller, and many of my participant interviewees consider the caller and their guidance to be essential to barn dancing and beneficial to their enjoyment of the event. And phrasing possibly helps participants to feel they're on a level playing field. Calling and phrasing helps to equalise the event, allowing individuals to feel that they are blending in rather than standing out. As so few aspects of folk dancing are as prescribed and discussed in as much detail as phrasing, this emphasis perhaps becomes magnified as a central indicator of a successful dance. For participants, non-specialist participants, this emphasis on phrasing with the music is perhaps less important than the synchronicity amongst and within dancing sets, which can help to mitigate feelings of self-consciousness. I just want to pass on a downside to this stress on phrasing. In contrast to the genre's emphasis on inclusivity, a strict adherence to phrasing could possibly prevent some dancers from completing the sequence at the pace which they might find the most comfortable. Phrasing has become so important because of the central role of the caller, and arguably phrasing enhances caller reliance by taking away participant agency. Whilst many participants having little experience with the genre are happy with this situation, it does add to a reliance upon teaching and largely removes the opportunity for participants to engage in this dance genre without constant verbal support. Okay, dances, the bit you've all been waiting for. Dances, this is my last micro section, so don't worry, you haven't got long to go now. So during my fieldwork, I attended 30 dance events and witnessed the practice of 21 callers. I noted 300 individual dances, of which I could only identify 124. The three most popular dances of my fieldwork, Sicilian Circle was called by 16 callers, Strip the Willow, also known as Drops of Brandy, 10 callers, and Cumberland Square 8, 9 callers. These were all part of Kennedy's repertoire re-evaluation and were printed in the community dancers manuals over there. There is a large amount of newly composed dances which were selected by callers, but these form a small amount of shared repertoire between callers. So 80 of the 124 named dances collated during my field research were composed by 20th century keen folk dancers, but very few were selected by more than one caller. And it is these newly composed dances which I am going to discuss now. English social folk dance is typical rather than atypical of 20th century British leisure development in its tendency towards specialism. Similar dance forms, from old-time, sequence, Scottish country dance, all saw the continual creation of new material amongst keen participants. Many callers appear to gain gratification by introducing new repertoire and dance sequences, and this is perhaps most pertinent in less commercially orientated dance leaders. Not everyone was always in favour of these new dances. The extent to which new material could be seen as an extension of tradition was questioned in the 1980s and 1990s as the amount of new material grew. Critics including Peter Kennedy, Douglas Kennedy's son, and Tony Foxworthy contributed concerned correspondence to English Dance and Song on the subject of new dance creation. It was argued that with such a large proportion of new dances, traditional material has to be inevitably sidelined. One FDIS member even went so far as to suggest that the Social Dance Club was a more accurate title than the English Folk Dance and Song Society. Conventionally, dance publications gave minimal ascription, often making it difficult to ascribe provenance. New dances could easily gather a sense of authorlessness, and I'm not entirely convinced that the internet has dissipated this trend. Dance composition is now an ingrained part of the contemporary social folk dance scene. Interestingly, the sheer number of dances and the lack of shared repertoire between callers reinforces a general reliance upon a dance leader to explain the dance. Only a handful of dancers appear to have any resonance for participants. Knowledge of figures has become more important in creating dancer competency and confidence than the memorisation of whole dances, and this perhaps helps to explain why so few dance titles appear to have any choreographic familiarity for participants, and why requests are so uncommon. In the late 20th century, the concept of the living tradition has been characterised by keen dancers as being one of continual development. A new dance creation is seen as an important contribution to this idea. Without change, the tradition will fossilise and become irrelevant, it is argued. At the FDIS's Callers Development Day, the concept of the living tradition was widely invoked, particularly when discussion turned to change and how the genre can become more inclusive. Newly composed dances have come to form an increasingly important part of the ideology of social folk dance. Figures are building blocks that can be reconfigured to create new dances. What I find interesting is that the meta-limits of acceptable repertoire appear to have been frozen in the 1950s. So whilst callers do utilise new dances, there is no inclination to reintroduce popular sequence group dances of the early 20th century, for example. The callers at the events of my research did not select party dances from the 20s and 30s, such as Bumps a Daisy, Lambeth Walk, Hokey Cokey, Paliglide, the Conga, this sort of thing. Instead, many callers tap into the dances disseminated at keen events such as folk festivals, Cayley series and dance clubs, presenting a repertoire which reflects the contemporary keen social folk dance world. With a modal average of 10 dances per event, callers have a large repertoire of acceptable easy dances which they can teach, with conversely limited time to actually do so. Today, I didn't want to present a linear argument, how boring, but to share some of the most interesting and pertinent aspects of English social folk dance past and present. So I do apologise for flitting around like some sort of excited butterfly in a field of buttercups. One of the things which has really struck me during the course of my PhD research is the relationship between the growth of interest in barn dances in the 1970s and the wider decline of formal social dance in Britain. So for many, barn dances are now the only form of sequence dance they might be aware of. For a wedding, the choice might be between a disco or a barn dance, or both. Kennedy's introduction of a caller seems to have encouraged non-folk dancers to hold events secure in the knowledge that there will be help with movement. It is a model that has been exported to Scotland and Ireland. The relationship with Wild West Americana has proved similarly useful in encouraging organisers to host dances. When formal dinner dances declined in appeal, a barn dance offered a more casual, fun alternative. Dance events themselves continue to evolve. Now they have less or no couple dances at all. They increasingly appear to be held for private rather than ticketed functions, and participants appear to have fewer skills now that country dancing is less commonly taught in schools. I wonder in what direction they will travel in next. Thank you very much.